Okay, so today I'm going to take you through the scoring and interpretation of the Young Schema questionnaire, with particular focus on the short form of the questionnaire, the 90-item version of the YSQ, which is the one that I recommend for clinical practice. Now, the first thing I want to just remind everyone of is what it is that the YSQ is actually measuring. Okay, so it's measuring the 18 early maladaptive schemas formulated in Jeffrey Young's model. And here you can see this includes the first 9 core schemas, as well as the sort of second 9 schemas that might be thought of as more being a bit compensatory. Okay. Now the next thing I want to show you, if we get straight to it, is how are you going to score this up? All right. So you'll need the Excel template that we tend to use. All right. There's a few of these going around, but this is the one that we use. Right, the first thing here is we're going to plug in all of your responses per item. Right, so for item 1, we're going to plug that in there, and you're going to plug them all in, boom, 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 all the way until you get down to the bottom here, and you'll see that the last one there at item 90. Now you can see this feeds into a sort of item total in the middle here. All right, for each domain. So this is emotional deprivation, abandonment, mistrust, abuse. Okay, item totals, as well as a sort of frequency count of the extreme scores. Okay, which is how many times the patient has responded in an extreme way in terms of 5s and 6s. Okay, so with scoring being from 1 to 6. Okay, so these are occasions in which the patient is going, yes, that's me, that's how I feel, yes. All right. Now this leads to the central interpretation, right, which is taken from the 5s and 6s, which is that. If we look here, right, the main interpretation on the YSQ is we're looking at how many times the patient has scored a 2 or more, right, on each schema domain. So if the patient has scored a 2 or more in terms of the extreme scores, these are probably important schemas for this patient and require follow-up in your assessment. Okay, this is the central idea. All right, anything that scores under 2, we're going to kind of treat as noise or sort of probably invalid, right? But we're really going to focus our attention on these schemas. Okay. Now, while we're here, I'm just going to also point your attention to another method for interpreting the YSQ, which is the total score method. All right, if you go with the total scores, if you come up here, either to figure 2 or even figure 1, you can see the other way of doing it is sometimes patients are a bit reluctant to respond in an extreme way. So you might get a pattern where there's nothing coming up on the extreme scores, but you can see some sort of pattern emerge from the total score. So here we're just going to see which schema is really poking out as potentially important schemas. Right, so in this one here, we might focus on the self-sacrifice schema and also the unrunning standards and the subjugation schema and follow them up for in your assessment. Okay. Now this leads us also to think about what to do next with our schema assessment. All right, and I guess it comes back to this. So you'll notice here on the right-hand side we have all of the central assessment methods for identifying schemas and coping styles in Schema Therapy. You'll notice that questionnaire data is just one of these 7 assessment methods, and in our approach, it's not even the central method. All right, it's just one way of getting at, what might be the important schemas for this person. Okay. So the key principle here being triangulation of data. All right. This is always going to protect us from making hypotheses that could turn out to be wrong. All right. So we want to triangulate those. Now the other thing is, now why might that be? I guess it's worth quickly talking about why might it be the case that we're going to treat the YSQ as a bit more of a screener. And the answer is that the YSQ is valid, but it's not that valid. It's valid more in terms of being a screening tool. It will pick up schema patterns, more times than not, but you don't want to bank on it, all right? Because the first thing is the YSQ is just like any other self-report tool. Relying on self-report leaves it open to all sorts of biases. Okay. Now, probably the central bias that I'm aware of is that the YSQ is very much impacted by the state in which someone is in when they fill it out. Okay, if they're in a very vulnerable state, they're much more likely to be in touch with their schemas and report those schemas. And in fact, if they're in too much of a vulnerable state, they might even over-report schemas and report schemas that might not even be too important for them. And conversely, if a patient is in a very strong coping state, let's say a very detached, avoidant coping state, they might very quickly jump over the schemas and sort of give it ones or twos, sort of that doesn't apply to me, I don't really care, that kind of thing. And where actually, schema activation might have been the very thing that put them in that avoidant place. All right, so in those cases, very avoidant or detached patients might underreport their schemas. And conversely, the other way of thinking about it is those that are overcompensating at times, if they're very strong in their overcompensation, might also underreport their schemas because of the sort of overcompensating, nothing affects me and I'm awesome, or I can cope with anything kind of idea. All right, even though that coping state might be kind of driven by underlying schemas. So the next thing I want to show you is, if I bring it along here, is we come back to our Excel files, and I'm going to show you now another thing, which is here's what you'll run into eventually, particularly if you're treating personality disorders. This is a kind of typical reading you might get from someone who either has a severe personality disorder, or maybe something more along the lines of a borderline personality disorder, or even something you might call complex trauma. So you can see here, person is scoring out on, basically with our extreme score method, scoring out on just about every schema. All right. Now this presents a particular problem for the basic schema model. All right. Up until now, we've sort of focused on the basic schema model, which is formulating by integrating the background needs information, the development of specific schemas, and then understanding the three coping styles that might emerge from that. If you have a patient with 15 or 16 schemas, that can very much become unworkable, right? Because you're going to have this model of three coping styles by, let's say, 15 schemas. You've got sort of end up with a sort of 45-factor model. Okay, so for this very reason, Jeff Young formulated a second model of schema therapy that we call the mode model, and it's in these cases it might be indicated that you switch to a mode, what's called a mode formulation, rather than going down the path of a basic schema formulation. Okay, so just be aware of that. Now we do briefly cover the mode model at the end of course 1, but also we focus entirely on the mode model in course 2. All right, so just be aware of that. We are heading down that path. Okay, but for now, we just wanted to introduce you to the basic scoring and interpretation of the YSQ, and we trust that this has been helpful for that purpose. Thanks for listening.